Her sculptures transform cheap, often throwaway objects into regal mythical forms. A styrofoam tray or plastic bowl is recreated as nest, in which bird-like figures perch. She combines materials by casting and cutting, embellishment and bold color, all of which treats these otherwise mundane forms with a care that makes one ask questions about the hybrids of our future. On today's edition of Art Now, we'll look at the work of Tammie Rubin.
Hi, welcome to Art Now, a program where we talk to artists whose work is part of our community. I'm Sarah Ross, and today our guest will be Tammie Rubin. Hi, Tammie.
Hi, how are you?
The first question I wanted to ask is, where are you from originally?
I was born in Chicago on the southwest side.
And how did you first start making art?
Well, let's see. I think it's been through like numerous experiences. I didn't have a lot of formal art classes when I was in grade school or high school, but I was lucky enough to live in a city like Chicago. It's like this mecca of art and architecture. And I probably think that I've been to the Art Institute every year of my life from like kindergarten to senior year of high school. And I feel like I'm really, I loved going to that institution. And the things that I really was interested in and things that made the biggest impression was like there's this medieval Renaissance section, and it's kind of a corridor between rings. And when you go there, there's everything from armor to like these tiny diptychs carved in ivory. And I was always really drawn to looking at the objects. I love painting as well, but it was really the things that were more tactile. Just walking around the city of Chicago, just looking at the facades of buildings, and any kind of time I had an opportunity to make any art, it was always the things that were most satisfying to me were the things that were 3D, things that I could actually hold and make and carve.
So did you make projects in your house when you were young?
I did, and I guess I think I almost forget about these things, but then my mom keeps everything, and I look at them, and I like, well, I don't even think this was for school. I just think I just did it on my own. I would just start making things on my own, so.
How did you come to clay?
The only art class I took was my senior year in high school, and one of the projects was a clay project. And it was literally something just like small, like pinch pots or something like that. And, I think that must have stayed with me because when I did come to college, one of the first classes I took was a ceramics class. And I just kept taking them, and I just loved the professor that I had, and he was just very kind of inspirational and just really engaging, and he really encouraged me, and so I took as many classes as I could until I had to actually pick. I couldn't take any more classes unless I became a major, and it just seems like that's what I should be doing, so that's what I did.
And so what did you do after school? How did you become engaged in a clay community?
Well, I actually went to the University of Illinois. I went here for undergrad, and the year I graduated, there's a studio that's still in town that's run by Michael Schwegman. It's called Boneyard Pottery, and he actually gave me a studio there. So for my first year, right out of school, I had a place to work. I then moved back to Chicago probably about a year later, and I had a space at the Lil Street Art Center, which has actually moved to a great new location. And so I worked and for my day job, and then I went to my studio at night and made work. And I did that for a couple of years until I felt like I was ready to really have some sort of dialogue with someone else and not just be isolated in my studio. And that's when I applied for grad school, and I went to the University of Washington in Seattle.
That's awesome. Many clay artists make functional work, and your work is much more sculptural. How did you come to making sculptural work in clay?
Well, I actually feel like that's a little bit of a misconception. I feel like that are as many sculptural ceramic artists as functional artists. I just think that it's easy to identify ceramics when it's functional because it's something that a lot of people are more familiar with. But a lot of my influences were actually sculptural artists right off the bat. So, Patty Forashino or Peter Voulkos or Ken, Price, there's all these people that I was kind of looking at, and it seems like it was just a choice that just happened. I didn't even, I don't think there was even any debate whether I was going to be a functional artist or a sculptor. I really went straight to sculpture. So.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of your work uses some of these sort of functional objects, like paper plates and things like that, in your work. So it is this interesting play with what clay has historically been used for, at least functional objects. So your practice has always been sculptural. Can you walk us through a piece of your work? How what are the steps involved in making one of your pieces?
I think, most artists, if you kind of go into their studios or their homes, they're collectors. And so I've always collected objects, and at some point I just really started looking at the things that I was collecting and wondering why I was collecting those particular things. So I started to make molds of some of those things, so plaster molds of some of those things. And then I also started to make prototypes of forms that I found interesting, and then I would make plaster molds of those. And that would allow me to make multiple casts, so multiple pieces out of clay using a liquid slip, so a liquid casting slip.
Can you describe what a slip is to folks at home?
Sure. So it's, if you think of a clay as kind of this malleable material, it's actually, you took that clay and you made it into a slurry, and then you mixed it so that it was able to, the heavy particles was able to be suspended so that you could pour into something and also pour out. And that's actually called deflocculant. And so a casting slip is basically a clay slurry, a clay that's been made into a slurry, so that you're able to pour into a mold and then pour out the excess. And so what's left in the mold is the skin. It's kind of like what we call the cast.
And can you just describe for folks at home things that they might have in their household that is made of a slip?
Oh, well,
I was thinking like a lot of salt and pepper shakers.
Oh yeah, salt and pepper shakers, or any kind of canisters for cookies, or even, the fine china that you have, that's made into a mold. But, if we think about molds, that's almost anything kind of product that's been made in multiples is made out of some type of mold. So your remote control or your razor blade, all those things have been vacuum molded in some sort of way, and it's just the material is not clay, it's plastic or metal or
Right. Thanks. And then can we go back to walking through your pieces? How do you make work?
So again, I start with these prototypes of forms that I'm very interested in, and I actually make quite a few, any form that's interesting me, I just go ahead and I make a mold out of that. And then I actually pour slip into it and I cast these forms. And then I have basically this, like a table full of these cast forms. And then it becomes a lot like kind of collage or like drawing, where I actually cut these forms. So I rarely use the whole thing that I've actually, of that whole original form. And so I cut them and score them and slip them together to make these kind of new sculptural forms. And then I'm able to really add and subtract. So these are some best pieces that have gone through that initial firing that I'm still trying to sort out as far as sculptural objects, like what they're going to become. But just to give you an example of the direct relationship between the plaster form and then the cast form. For instance, if we look here, this is the negative form for this shape here, which is the positive. And this is the same form as well. So I believe this was actually kind of an antique glass lamp shade or like sconce that I've used. These round kind of just overturned bowl shapes, where you can see that each one of the handling of that particular piece is a little bit different, but the original form is actually this form here. So,
and that's a plastic bowl.
And that's a plastic bowl that I've made a mold of. And so this is actually one of those kind of catering disposable items that you get. And then just for looking at this particular shape here, this part right from here to here, this is the negative mold for that. So this is a 2-part mold. These are 1-part molds, and I mean 2 parts because they release that way. And then just looking at this kind of longer cone shape comes out of this mold. And one thing you'll notice is that the molds, the negative shapes of the molds appear to be bigger, because they are bigger, because what happens is that as you fire the porcelain, it actually shrinks significantly. So you can see how these parts are kind of being used, and the forms are then brought together. A lot of these, like this part, like this is separate from this. And I do a lot of kind of playing. And and composing kind of on the spot once things have been bisqued before I glaze them or paint them, to make these kind of configurations.
So you have a first iteration where you cut the pieces together when the clay's still wet.
Yes.
And then you have a second chance to go back and combine pieces in the glazing process.
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
And sometimes I will do that by just, glazing parts together directly. So for instance, if I put glaze here and glaze here, wherever those two surfaces are going to touch, they're actually going to fuse together. What happens though is in the glazing process, they tend to shift. And that's something I've been trying to figure if I'm really excited about or not. So, before I think I was really scoring all of these pieces together. And so this is, two pieces that are now is one. And this is two pieces that is one, but this is actually separate from that. And so I've been doing these stackings where I actually glaze each piece and then I let the glaze act as the adhesive. And all of these kind of shifts that happen during firing become kind of a new element, something that I can't necessarily control because I don't know how it's going to happen. So I'm trying to open myself up to the idea of like this unexpected quality that happens when these things shift in the kiln. And then it becomes this new unexpected thing. So.
And what cone do you fire these at?
These are fired to cone 6.
And then the glazing?
And then they're usually multi-fired as well.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yep.
And so is this, what is this piece?
So this, one thing I collect is a lot of kind of really cheap plastic toys. And so this is a bowling pin for a child. And so, starting with this, I have a mold of this form, which is the negative of this form. And then I cast this form. And this is what we call just bisqueware. So it's just been fired once at a low temperature so that it's a hardened surface. And this is a piece that's, some of these pieces, they all don't end up being into sculptures, but this is a part where you can see that this now has added parts to it. And then also it has a underglaze and a glazed surface.
And can you describe what the underglaze and glaze surface is for folks who don't know?
So an underglaze is actually a refined clay. It's a really refined clay that's actually colored. Mm-hmm. And so when you actually paint it on, it's painting on clay onto itself. Okay. And there are no glass particles, there's no glass in it, so it's not shiny, it's matte, and it adheres well with the surface. A glaze, however, so if we look here, this is actually a colored clay where stains are mixed directly into the clay mixture. This is an underglaze slip, which actually is a clay that's been brushed on, that's highly refined. And this is actually what we call a glaze. And a glaze, people are pretty familiar with that, where it actually is made with silica, or what we also call glass, mm-hmm. To make this hardened, colorful surface.
Speaking of color, before I go forward, sorry, can you talk about the next steps? Is this a final piece that might get cut into other pieces, or would this now get reglazed or refired in a certain way?
It may be reglazed or refired.
Okay.
I think one step that I don't have to show you is the actual greenware step, which is the very first step. So, this has now been fired, but there's a cast before this that the clay is still malleable. It's not been fired, and you're actually able to manipulate it.
Okay.
And so a lot of the cutting that happens is actually at the greenware stage, at that first stage. So.
Okay. And then what you see on the table here are some pieces that have been completely fired, and these are just small objects that have not been worked into something, or they are part of something.
Well, these are actually on their way to a larger sculpture. These are some pieces, and sometimes this happens is that, I'll spend a lot of time making these pieces and then realize that they're not quite right. Or they're not the right part, and so therefore they end up going into one of these bins where, they may end up going into a piece later, or they may that may be their resting home.
Right.
So.
One thing that's so striking about your work is these amazing surfaces that you have. Can you talk a little bit about how these surfaces are made?
Sure. Well, when I started making this series of work, what was kind of interesting to me was this idea of having more immediacy in my work. From the period probably from undergrad to graduate school, I was using the figure. And once I graduated from graduate school, I really wanted to do something different. I wanted to be able to challenge myself. And so I put some parameters up, and one was that I was not going to use the human figure. Another one is I was going to learn a new skill, and that led me to working with plaster and molds. I was going to work and really challenge myself with color, which I hadn't done before. And the other thing is I wanted to have more immediacy in my work. So the casting slip, because it can be poured and dripped, it can be made into a paste and extruded. It has a lot of possibilities of the kind of textures that you can get. So for something like this, I actually have what we call a plaster slab. So it's just a slab of plaster. And then I would actually extrude liquid casting slip onto that surface. And then each one of these is an individual bead. So it starts to kind of dry and harden. And I pick that bead up and then I put it onto the surface of this piece. So if we looked at these, this actually has little indentations of dots that have been made by hand. And this one is actually a raised surface where these little clay beads have been made and then they've been added.
So the clay dries and it creates the beads, and then you pick them up by hand and adhere them?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So it's
time consuming.
It is time consuming and it's meticulous, but there's also something really satisfying about like extruding all these really small individual parts and then moving them to another surface. It's like, I love the idea of accumulation. So.
And then is this the same process that happens with a piece like this, or is this added?
So this is added. So instead of extruding or squeezing out clay onto the slab, for here I actually have small bottles where I create the bead directly onto the piece.
Okay.
So, and then here, I'll use like needles or whatever's appropriate to kind of make these perforations within the form as well. So.
And then with a piece like this, for instance, can you talk about that surface?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm using the same small squeeze bottle, but for here it's being put onto a slab. Here it's going directly onto the clay, and for here, instead of making a bead, I'm actually dragging that line out to elongate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just because there's so many interesting things on the table, can you tell folks at home what this is? Because it's so similar in form to this, but it's so different.
It's so different. So I don't actually know what the official name for these are, but they grow on trees. And there's actually several of these trees right behind my studio over here. And people call them oranges, but they've also have a couple of different names. And so this is actually a cast of what that fruit that comes off that tree is, and it's not edible, but they have a very interesting smell, and they look like brains. I mean, they're just so amazing, just what that form looks like.
Yeah,
so.
They're gorgeous, and you got a great cast of it.
Yeah.
You can hardly see the seam. It's amazing. The next question I have touches back on something that you mentioned before, and that is color. You have these amazing, bright, vibrant colors in your work. And I was wondering if you could talk about the choices that you make when it comes to color.
Well, like I said, when I started this body of work, one tenet I had upon, that I put upon myself was to actually really challenge myself with color, because my work had always been pretty muted. When I went to grad school, the thing was like everybody made work that was white. That's kind of this postmodern intellectualism that work has to be white, and so. I'd always loved looking at specific painters, especially color-filled painters, and really thinking about there's so much emotional weight that comes with color. It's something that people can immediately grab onto. They understand it. It's accessible. It pulls them in. And so I started to really look at the particular design colors or fashion colors that were around us, and started to incorporate those kind of colors into my work. So I feel like if we were looking at work from 2008 and then we looked around and see what the colors were for that year, then you could see a correlation between the two. And then I also had some interesting experience where I went to Tate Modern and I saw the Yves Klein monochromatic blue paintings in person. So I'd always seen them in books, but I'd never seen them in person, and I just didn't really understand those paintings until I stood in front of them, where you're just like completely enveloped by color. Like it really truly is, it almost is like a spiritual experience that you fall into it. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to like incorporate that into my work. So
the next questions that I have are directly about different bodies of work. One that specifically uses color in amazing ways is a group of work titled Aviary, excuse me, Aviary from 2005, and it uses the likeness of consumer objects through casting, like styrofoam containers, plates, plastic toys, but you embellish them and hybridize them with other forms. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the logic of the hybrids that you make. In other words, what encourages you to slice these 2 or 3 different objects together? What are the choices that you make? Is it based on form, or is it based on the objects themselves?
Well, I think it's both, but I think it's, this work really came into fruition after living in Seattle for a number of years. And, I grew up in the Midwest, and our grass outside, we had a grid of lawn that was green. Chicago's a very gridded city. Like when you fly into the city, you can see that the city is built on grids. And so moving to a place like Seattle where it's not a gridded city. There's all of these wild, people have these really wild gardens. And in the middle of the winter, it just felt like everything was so lush, just like green and just like overflowing, and all of the bridges, and you can see mountains in the distance. And I really think that started to influence me a lot, because it made me realize how foreign that felt to me, how like separate I felt from that. And, having conversations with people about going hiking and things like that, I was just like, I don't know if I have a real relationship with nature. So, like what are the things that I would consider things that I see all the time? And that kind of led me to look at the things that I see all the time, and to almost use those manufactured forms to incorporate it in this idea of a new nature, a new like fantastical creatures. And so that's kind of how it came to be about. And so it was really looking at things that I saw around me, and using those things to create these like mythic creatures.
And can you talk about the titles of those pieces in particular, maybe a couple distinct ones?
So one thing I found was that, I was curious, like, well, I'm making these kind of creatural forms, these chimerical forms, and like, okay, I have to title them, right? So this is always the issue for an artist, like, what do you title your work? So I started to look at what scientists do when they classify a new species, and I always thought that this was a very serious activity that they engaged in. And then when I was researching, I found that there were scientists who were naming things after their like wives and girlfriends or rock bands, and because they put the Latin phrasing on it, we took it seriously. It gave it authenticity. So I really kind of love that idea of the fact that so I started to use some Latin titles, and some are real and some are fictional, just like the work. There are some real elements in there, and there's some completely fantastical elements in there.
Can you give an example of a fantastical title that you use?
One is called Anas, Invisitus, and so it's actually the invisible, and it actually means Anas's duck in Latin. And so there were a series that, specifically I was looking at the rubber duck toy, and I was taking that and manipulating in these different ways. So this whole kind of series from the aviary all start with duck, and then some sort of descriptor. And it's not really important that people know exactly what that descriptor is, but sometimes because Latin is, is the root of our language, that you can kind of guess what it is. It gives you a sense of.
Right.
So.
Right. And then can you give an example of a serious title or authentic title from science that you've used?
Well, I haven't used any from science. I was just looking at the idea that these scientists were naming things. But there was a scientist who named a plant after Johnny Rotten from Sid Vicious. And then I thought that was from the Sex Pistols. And I thought that was really pretty funny. So
that's great. Your most recent works seem to deal more with the sort of formal and aesthetic qualities of the cone-shaped rather than mass-produced consumer materials. How did you make that shift, and what kinds of ideas are you interested in communicating here?
Well, the cone shape or the conical shape, it's a form that is very, very familiar to us all. It's the funnel, it's the megaphone, it's the caution cone. You know, there are different kind of like symbolic hats that have that kind of shape, and it always seems to have this. You know, you get this sense that something is being exchange, like, and you know, the form itself actually lends to some sort of idea of communication or some sort of exchange. And so it was really the kind of the formalism of that particular form that I was really interested in, and this idea of the fact that I see this form all over the place. And then, you know, you're driving and you look up and the satellites, the antennas, and the cell towers, and there's all of this invisible communication. I call it invisible because, you know, you can't see it, but you know it's happening, and you know these things are for that. And it made me start to think, you know, also about like, how is that different from mantras or prayers? And like, you know, I grew up pretty in a really religious background, and you know, I always thought the steeple was, you know, God's antenna. You know what I mean? Like, it's transmitting these prayers up to God. And so, you know, I wanted to think like, well, if I created some sort of contraptions for communications that were beyond this world, like what would that thing look like? Mm-hmm. What would that thing that I made look like? Mm-hmm. And it's this idea of, you know, I love the word contraptions because I feel like it brings up these issues of, you know, people in their garages kind of making these really, like, you know, wing machines, you know, right. Things that seem great, are great ideas, but may not work. Right. Or, you know, maybe if you believe enough, they would work. And so that kind of led to this body of work, the idea of these imagined communication contraptions that could be created. So
one of the installations is called Silence Magical Thinking in Progress. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that piece. It hangs from the ceiling. Mm-hmm. It does have this feeling that things are sort of bouncing back and forth between these cones. Mm-hmm. Can you describe how you came to that, especially came to a form that is hanging from the ceiling as opposed to being on the wall or on a flat surface?
So that piece is called Lingering Apparatus, and it is actually like two large conical shapes, and they protrude from the wall probably about 24 inches each one. They come out really directly into the viewer's space, and you can stand between those pieces and actually put your ear up to each piece. But the thing is if you're looking in one, you're at a distance from the other one, so you can never be you never have a direct engagement with both sides at the same time. So you have to kind of pick. And the incorporation of like stainless steel or metal into my work is something that I'm actually pretty excited about. So.
Excellent. That's a fantastic piece. I love it. Thanks for watching Art Now. Our guest has been Tammie Rubin. Tammie's work can be seen in the show Flashback at Pottery Northwest in Seattle, and Craftsmanship, Concept, and Innovation at the Red Lodge Clay Center in Red Lodge, Montana. Also, her work can be seen at TammieRubin.com on her personal website. We hope you have enjoyed today's show, and we also hope it will inspire you to explore the local art scene and make your own art now.